Today I want to discuss the question, what is a story? And this is a very big question. It's a lot to jump into, but I've been reading a book recently. This is A Swim in a Pond in the Rain by George Saunders. And it's sort of an exploration of several short stories by Russian writers. And it's based off a class that he teaches on creative writing. So I think there's some very interesting ideas that I've been encountering just in the first section. I've read the first story and I have a few takeaways. So I kind of wanted to discuss that with you. And one of the big questions he talks about is, what is a story? He kind of starts with a definition, and I think it's really interesting. So I'd love to jump into this. So his first definition he gives is a linear temporal phenomenon. That's his definition of a story. It's a little bit clinical, but the first story that we actually read in the book is In the Cart by Anton Chekhov, who I believe is also famous for Chekhov's gun. So the way that he describes stories is at first as a call and response. You give the audience something and they respond to it. So for example, you introduce the main character. Well, the first time you see the main character, they're going to draw certain conclusions, right? And as you progress through the story and give them new information about this character, their mind, the audience's mind, is going to narrow down on who this person is. Maybe they'll connect that person to someone they know. Maybe they will see something of themselves in the character. So as you're going through this story, this linear journey through the story, you'll be doing sort of this call and response with the audience. And that's important because as you write, you should think about, okay, I've just written this thing about the character. What is my audience going to conclude from that? I think a lot of times we write a story and we kind of just get it out and put it down on the page, and there's sort of this moment of, oh, I've created something, I'm so proud of it. But then you have to ask the question, well, what does the audience actually think about what I just wrote? What are they thinking as they go through the story? So what he actually does in the first chapter is he just takes the story one page at a time. So you read the first page and then he kind of asks some questions and sort of has you think about how you're feeling in that moment. So after the first page, you've gotten a little bit of information about the character, but you don't really know. And so the character in this book is Maria, I think is how you say her name, and she's a teacher heading back to her town after going into another city to make some purchases. And so she's on this cart, just riding along this dirty road with this peasant leading her, and she's having all these internal thoughts. And when you first meet her, she just seems kind of like an unhappy person, sort of, I guess, obsessed with not her. She teaches, she's a teacher, but she's not obsessed with the children or even the teaching. The thing that she actually is focused on is the exams that she has to give at the end of each semester. So that's kind of her main focus and the thing that kind of takes up her mind. But then something interesting happens as you go through the story. And something that he talks about is every story, there's like a transfer of energy that's happening throughout the story. And I find this concept really interesting because, it's sort of like you're playing this like pass it along throughout the story. So imagine this energy is a bucket of water and you've got to pass it along the line to go put out a fire at the end, and you don't want to spill a drop down that whole line of people as you're passing it, right? So every sentence that you write, every page is that energy is being transferred, and hopefully a drop isn't being spilled. And again, that's all about your audience, right? As you are passing the bucket and keeping the energy going, you're keeping your audience's attention and you're keeping them on the path with you. Another great analogy he uses in the book is that imagine you're riding a motor car, like a motorcycle, and you're driving and the audience member, the person reading, is right next to you in the little sidecar. And for you want to keep them as close to you as possible, but with every turn, if you make a turn and they get a little farther away from you, there becomes a gap between you and the reader, then that transfer of energy is getting lost. So you have to, as the writer, be able to track where your audience is and if they're following. And if they're right there along with you, do they care about Maria, the main character? Do they care about what she's thinking? Are they interested in who she is? I think another way to keep this going is something he talks about in the book is variation. So kind of having constant change. So let's say at the beginning, you mentioned something in the story. Well, the second time you mention it, you need to put it in a different light or add some detail to make it different. Because if you just say, oh, she picked up the bag, she gets out of the cart, she gets back in the cart. Oh, she picks up the bag again and gets out of the cart and then gets back in. That's very static. There's not much happening. There's not much variation there. And so it feels to the audience as kind of false because things are kind of always changing in life, right? So you need some sort of constant change happening, even if it's in a small way. And so for Maria, throughout the story, there's this nobleman, rich landowner that she kind of sees a few times and kind of has these thoughts of like, oh, could I be with him? They know each other, they have this past, but as she looks at him, she also realizes he's kind of a drunkard, he's kind of simple, she doesn't really see the potential between them. And yet a part of her, because she's so lonely, wants a relationship with this person, or really any relationship, to be loved, really. And so as you move through the story in the card, you sort of discover that this main character just wants to be loved. And so all this loneliness, all of these internal thoughts she's having is all around the idea of wanting love and community, really. So another interesting thing that he talks about in the book as we go through the story is what is the purpose of each element you're putting in? So for example, they stop in this town and, because we're reading a page at a time, you kind of stop after she's gone to the town and had a couple interactions and you say, well, what was the purpose of that? Well, in the story, she goes to this town and there's all these peasants in this bar and she kind of has some interactions with them that are not positive. They kind of disdain her a little bit because she is a teacher and she's a little bit above them in status. And so there's a tension there where she's really an outsider, even in a place where she's lived for 13 years. And so you see this juxtaposition between her and the locals, and that is information you can learn more about her. You can learn more about why she's lonely, about why she feels the way she feels, and why she sees things a certain way. So it's just, you're gaining more information. And so this whole town, this whole scene in the bar serves one purpose of showing you more about how Maria fits into the world. And if you have an element in your story where you're writing something, you have something there, and you look at it and you say, well, what's the purpose of this thing? If it doesn't add anything to the story, then why is it there? The idea of Chekhov's gun, which I mentioned earlier, is like, if you see a gun in the first act, it needs to go off in the third act, or however the rule goes. And so you can't just put something there randomly. It has to have a purpose, right? So, and this is another thing he talks about in kind of redefining a story. And I think this definition is a little more helpful for me. He says it's a limited set of elements that we read against one another. So again, you have all these elements and there's a juxtaposition. There's a contrast, a comparing contrast happening between the elements you have in your story. So as you're writing a story and you're putting all these elements, characters, locations, props, what is the purpose of each of these elements? And does it help to compare and contrast with the story that you're telling? Is the character, when they walk into a room and pick something up, does it tell you something about them? When they walk into a bar or a location and people react to them, does their reaction tell you something about how they fit into the world, who they are as a person, or even just what the theme of your story is? And that's an interesting and I think very helpful way to think about story. So a limited set of elements that we read against one another. Love that definition. And another thing that he kind of talks about in this first part is asking the question, is it a story yet? And I think this is where a lot of writers struggle, myself included, is you're writing something, you get to a point, I've even gotten to the end of a draft, it's finished, it's done, everything's there, and I'm like, this isn't a story. There's something missing. It's maybe 90%, 80% there, but it's not a story yet. And I've never quite thought about it in those terms, but I've definitely felt that feeling. And so that question is very helpful for me, because if you say, is it a story yet? And you feel, and you as a writer have instincts, right? So you feel I don't think it is, right? That's a great question to ask and a great way to sort of do a pulse check on your story. So a couple things he says about this is, I think, especially when it comes to the ending, you know, being able to imagine the lives of the character continuing on beyond your story. That's a great way to think of like, okay, have I reached the end? Is the ending good enough? Well, can your audience see the lives of the characters continuing on after the story? You know, that's, I think, a very cool way to think about ending stories. And, you know, I've gotten a lot from this book just in this first part. And you know, another definition that you hear a lot, and I think something that he even kind of wrestles with in the book is there's something, a lot of people say your character has a change in some way. So there's a moment of change that happens, your character's changed irrevocably, there's no going back, they're changed forever by the writing the story that you've written, you know? So I find that a little bit unsatisfying personally. I find myself struggling when, you know, people say, oh, you've got to have an arc and change and everything. And I think that's mostly true, but there are a lot of stories where characters don't change. There's a lot of genres where it's sort of built in. For example, horror. A lot of times horror isn't really about the character changing. It's about the character being destroyed because they wouldn't change. And so you've got to understand what kind of story you're telling and if that makes sense. Now, something he kind of gets to by the end of this whole section, and I think this is something that has really helped me think about it in a new way, is that it's not that your characters change in some way, it's that your audience changes in some way. Something in their mind has been moved in some way that otherwise wouldn't if they hadn't read your story. And I think that's a great way to think about telling a story, because it's not based on, you know, making certain things happen in your story so that it feels like this is a story. It's actually about the relationship between your audience and your story, which I think is the most important part of any story, is how does your audience feel about the characters and the plot and the pacing and all these things. These are the questions that I'm constantly asking myself as I write. So Chekhov actually says art doesn't have to solve problems. It only has to formulate them correctly. So for a lot of stories, it's just about telling the truth. It's just about getting a version of reality out there that people can see and feel and say, oh, I recognize that. Oh, I see myself in that. I see someone else in that. And that actually helps you know, okay, this is a story because people were moved by it. People felt it. And so I think that gives you a kind of a wider operating base, because a lot of times when people talk about story, they talk about 3-act structure and character arcs and change and all this kind of thing. But I find that, again, to be limiting, especially when you're writing a first draft. Like, it isn't always about the structure. Sometimes it's about how your audience is feeling along the journey. So, you know, we're talking about that call and response, transfer of energy, you know, having kind of constant change and making sure each element has a purpose, right? These are all important parts of this. But ultimately, I think the main question is, does this story do something to the audience? Does it move them in some kind of way? So that's the real question you should be asking as you write. So maybe as a practical way to apply all this, why don't we write a short scene where 2 characters discuss a topic that you're passionate about? And don't stop writing until you feel like it's a story. So I don't know what that means for you, but I think it might be a fun exercise. And what do you guys think? What do you think makes a story? So please like, subscribe, comment, all that jazz. Thanks, guys.